On November 29, 1943, more than 300 B-7 flying fortresses crossed into German airspace with Bremen as their target. One of those aircraft was a bomber named Ricky Tiktavi. Inside the tail section, a 19-year-old staff sergeant named Eugene Moran knelt behind twin .50 caliber machine guns. He told the crew to get their cameras ready because he planned to light up the sky. The pilot focused on flying the aircraft. Ricky Tiktavi was on its fourth mission. By the time the bombs were released, the aircraft had already begun to fall behind the formation. Alone in the sky, it became an easy target. German fighters attacked in waves. Bf-100s fired rockets into the fuselage. Then Bf-109s and Fw-190s moved in from multiple angles. Moran returned fire from the tail. One by one the voices on the intercom stopped. 8 of the 10 crew members were killed. The navigator escaped from the front section. Moran was now the only person left alive inside the aircraft. A German flak round struck the fuselage and split the bomber into 2 parts. The front section with the wings and engines separated and fell away. The tail section, which weighed about 12 tons, had no wings, no engine and no controls, yet it continued moving forward with Moran still inside. He tried to open the escape hatch, but bent metal kept it sealed. His parachute was damaged. There was no way out. The tail section began to fall. For miles below was the German countryside. Moran had no way to slow his descent, no way to guide the fall, and no chance to jump. He was trapped inside wreckage, dropping from 28,000 feet through open sky. Then he did something that should not have been possible. That part comes later. To understand how a man ends up alone inside a falling section of an aircraft, it is important to understand his assigned role. The tail gunner on a B-7 worked in a position that most people would avoid even on the ground. At 5 miles above the earth in extreme cold with enemy fighters behind him, it became the most isolated role on any Allied bomber. The tail gunner could not see the rest of the crew. He could not reach them or touch another person during the mission. The only access point was a narrow crawl through the fuselage past the waist guns and the ball turret and across the bomb bay catwalk. Once inside, the gunner was separated from everything except threats approaching from behind. He was also the last crew member who could exit if the aircraft was lost. Others were closer to escape hatches. He had to crawl the entire length of the fuselage to reach an exit. In combat, that crawl often decided survival. The position itself was about the size of a phone booth. To reach the tail, a gunner crawled from behind the cockpit through the radio room, then crossed a narrow catwalk over the open bomb bay, which was only 9 inches wide with nothing below except a long drop. He moved through the waist gun section where 2 gunners stood at open windows and finally entered a tunnel leading to the tail compartment. The space waiting for him was about 4 feet wide. There was no proper seat. The gunner knelt on the floor and leaned against a small bicycle-style seat for support. His legs stayed folded and his knees pressed against metal surfaces. In front of him were 2 M2 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, each loaded with 565 rounds. Each gun weighed 64 pounds. The barrels pointed backward through a small plexiglass panel. That panel was the only barrier between the gunner and the open sky, and it offered no real protection. A 20mm cannon round could pass through it easily. The gunner had no space to stand. Anyone taller than 5 feet 10 inches would touch the ceiling with his helmet. His shoulders brushed the sides. Equipment filled the compartment, including oxygen hoses, intercom wires, heated suit connections, and parachute harness straps. The parachute itself was too large to wear and was stored nearby within reach in theory, but not always in practice during combat. Once in position, the gunner was completely isolated. He could not see any crew member. The closest man, the nearest waist gunner, was more than 20 feet ahead around a bend and hidden behind equipment and ammunition boxes. Communication depended entirely on the intercom. If it failed, the tail gunner had no awareness of what was happening elsewhere in the aircraft. Ken Tucker, a tail gunner with the 15th Air Force, completed 35 missions in a B-7 called Quater 2 based in Foggia, Italy. On every mission he crawled through the same tunnel, then settled onto the bicycle seat and connected his oxygen mask and heated suit. Tucker described himself as someone comfortable with isolation. The conditions in the tail did not trouble him. His first combat mission was not with his assigned crew. Standard procedure placed new gunners with experienced crews for their first mission over enemy territory. Tucker flew with unfamiliar crew members on a mission to Munich. He had never experienced combat before and questioned whether he was prepared. As the formation crossed the Alps and moved toward the target, the sky filled with flak bursts. Thousands of black clouds of shrapnel exploded at high altitude and sent fragments of hot metal in every direction. Tucker survived that mission and went on to complete 34 more. Even so, comfort in the tail was only relative. The isolation that suited his personality also created a serious risk. If the aircraft was damaged, if the oxygen line was cut, or if the heating system failed, the tail gunner had to manage the situation alone. No one could reach him in time. The rest of the crew was too far forward and the fuselage was too narrow and crowded with equipment. In an emergency, the tail gunner could not rely on calling for help. He had to act immediately and solve the issue himself, often with numb hands and limited visibility at 25,000 feet. At that altitude, the cold was not just uncomfortable. It was a direct threat. The B-7 operated at altitudes between 25,000 and 30,000 feet. At those heights, the outside temperature dropped to -50 or -60 degrees Fahrenheit. The aircraft was not pressurized and had no internal heating system. The fuselage was made of aluminum and included open gun ports in the waist section where strong winds moved through at high speed. In the tail, the plexiglass panel behind the guns provided slight protection from airflow but none from the temperature. The conditions inside the tail compartment were nearly identical to those outside. At -60 degrees, exposed skin could freeze in less than a minute. Metal surfaces became hazardous to touch and bare skin could stick to them instantly. If a gunner removed his glove to fix a jammed weapon, he had only seconds before frostbite began. The .50 caliber Browning machine guns jammed often. Fixing a jam required handling the charging mechanism, guiding the ammunition belt back into place, and sometimes pulling out a stuck casing. These tasks usually required bare hands or thin inner gloves. Every malfunction became a race against the cold. To address this issue, crews were issued electrically heated flight suits. These were one-piece garments with thin wires built into the fabric and connected to the aircraft electrical system through a plug. The technology was developed by General Electric and was based on earlier designs used in electric blankets. Before the war, GE had created a device called the Copper Man, which was used to test heated bedding. The same concept was later applied to flight suits, gloves, and boot inserts. In theory, these suits allowed crew members to function at high altitude. In practice, they were not dependable. The internal wiring was delicate and could break with normal movement. A single fault could disable heating to an entire section of the body. Damaged wires could also cause short circuits and burns. The temperature controls were basic and inconsistent. Some crew members became overheated and soaked in sweat, which later froze when the system stopped working. Others received little or no heat at all. In 1943, a large percentage of frostbite cases among bomber crews were linked to failures in these heated suits rather than direct exposure or poor preparation. Ken Tucker, who flew missions from Foggia, described the cold as constant and unavoidable. Improvements were made later in the war with better wiring and adjustable controls, but reliability remained limited. On missions that lasted 10 to 12 hours, a failure midway meant several hours of exposure without any solution. The tail gunner faced the most severe conditions. Waist gunners at least had a partner who could assist if needed. The ball turret gunner operated in a confined but enclosed space. The pilot and co-pilot were located in the most protected section of the aircraft. The tail gunner had no support. If his suit stopped working, no one would be aware. If his oxygen line froze and airflow stopped, the problem could go unnoticed. By the time the crew realized something was wrong, he would already be unconscious. Cold conditions could incapacitate a man without warning. However, German fighters posed a different kind of threat, and they focused their attacks with precision. They had a clear reason for targeting the tail first. The explanation for this tactic is directly connected to the role of the tail gunner and how it influenced aerial combat over Europe. If you want to understand how this situation developed and what occurred when the Luftwaffe found a way around it, you can subscribe and enable notifications. Now returning to 1942. When American heavy bombers first began flying over occupied Europe, the Luftwaffe chose to attack from the rear. This approach made sense. A fighter coming from behind moved in the same direction as the bomber, which reduced the closing speed and gave the pilot more time to aim. The fighter could hold position, align the shot, and fire steady bursts into the fuselage. Against earlier B-7 models, this method was effective. The rear section had limited defense. That changed with the arrival of the B-17E. Boeing introduced a dedicated tail gunner position equipped with two 50 caliber Browning machine guns covering the rear arc. German pilots who approached from behind were met with a level of defensive fire they had not expected. This quickly forced a change in perception. The tail guns became a serious threat, and the Luftwaffe had to reconsider its attack methods. One German pilot later described attacking a B-17 formation from behind as similar to approaching a dangerous target that could strike back instantly. The challenge was not limited to a single tail gunner. A formation of 36 B-17 bombers flying in a combat box could bring nearly 700 defensive machine guns into action against a single fighter. Approaching from the rear meant entering the combined fire of multiple tail gunners, waist gunners, and ball turret gunners at the same time. A Luftwaffe study estimated that destroying a B-17 from the rear required about 20 direct hits from 20 mm cannon shells. Given an average accuracy rate of around 2%, this meant roughly 1,000 rounds were needed to bring down one bomber from that angle. From the front, the situation was very different. The nose of the B-7 was its most vulnerable point. It had thinner protection, fewer guns covering the forward arc, and a closing speed of more than 500 miles per hour, which left very little time for defensive response. From this direction, 4 or 5 well-placed hits could be enough to destroy the aircraft. The Luftwaffe adjusted its tactics. They introduced a method known to American crews as 12 o'clock high. Fighters attacked from the front at a slightly higher position, then dived through the bomber formation at combined speeds close to 600 miles per hour. The time available to engage was extremely short, often around 2 seconds. This approach required accuracy, strong control, and the willingness to fly directly toward the formation. Skilled German pilots achieved success using this method, while less experienced pilots often failed to hit their targets. Despite this change, the rear of the formation remained under constant threat. The Luftwaffe developed another tactic referred to as the tail gunner's headache. Fighters positioned themselves on both sides of the formation at a distance of about 2,000 meters, then attacked in sequence. Each aircraft would dive toward the rear of the bombers, then break away after its pass. The attacks followed one another at short intervals and came from slightly different directions. This pattern was designed to overload the tail gunner with multiple targets and reduce his ability to respond effectively. Later in the war, the Stormbach units appeared. These were Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft fitted with extra cockpit armor and armed with 30 mm cannons. These fighters moved in very close and often opened fire at a distance of about 150 meters from the bombers. At that range, a single 30 mm shell could destroy a control surface or kill a crew member immediately. The tail gunner was always the main target. German pilots understood that if the tail turret stopped moving and the guns were no longer tracking, it meant the bomber had already lost its rear defense. That aircraft then became the primary target for the entire attacking group. The struggle between the tail gunner and the fighters behind him continued throughout the war. Tactics changed and weapons improved while formations were adjusted over time. However, the basic situation remained the same. The tail gunner occupied the most exposed position and faced every attack coming from behind with only 2 guns and a limited supply of ammunition between himself and the enemy. The issue was never whether the role was dangerous. The real question was how long a person could survive in that position. The numbers reflected the severity of the risk. When a crew joined the 8th Air Force in England, they were informed that a full combat tour required 25 missions. Completing all 25 meant they could return home. While this number appeared reasonable, it was far from easy. In 1943, the chance of finishing a full tour was about 1 in 4. This meant that 3 out of every 4 crews were shot down, killed, or captured before reaching mission 25. Conditions improved somewhat in 1944 when long-range P-51 Mustang escorts began accompanying bombers deep into German territory. Even then, the situation remained difficult. The 8th Air Force suffered more casualties than any other command in the American military during the Second World War. Around 26,000 men were killed in action and another 28,000 became prisoners of war. In total, 4,754 B-7 bombers were lost in combat, which represented about 37% of the 12731 aircraft produced. This means that 1 out of every 3 flying fortresses built in the United States did not return from operations. For the British, the losses were even higher. RAF Bomber Command conducted most of its missions at night, which reduced the threat from enemy fighters but did not protect against radar-guided anti-aircraft fire. The statistics for every 100 men who joined Bomber Command show the full situation. 51 were killed during operations. 9 more died in training accidents or crashes within England before reaching combat. 12 became prisoners of war. 3 were seriously wounded. 1 managed to evade capture. Only 24 completed their service without injury. This means that about 3/4 of all personnel in Bomber Command were killed, captured, or wounded. Among those who lost their lives were approximately 20,000 rear gunners. The Yorkshire Air Museum records that around 20,000 men died while serving in the most isolated position on the aircraft. The average age in Bomber Command was just 21 years old. The tail gunner faced a unique limitation based on one mechanical reality. He was always the last crew member with any chance of escape. In emergencies such as loss of control fire or structural failure, most of the crew exited through hatches located in the forward and middle sections of the aircraft. The pilot and co-pilot could leave through the cockpit windows or the front hatch. The bombardier and navigator used a hatch under the nose. Waist gunners were close to the main fuselage door. The ball turret gunner had to rotate his turret and climb back into the fuselage, which was difficult but still possible with assistance from nearby crew members. The tail gunner had no direct exit route. To bail out, he first had to remove his oxygen mask, unplug his heated suit, release his harness, secure his parachute from storage, attach it to his body, and then crawl forward through a narrow tunnel past the tail wheel area into the waist section to reach an exit point. In a stable aircraft, this process took time. In a damaged aircraft that was spinning, burning, or breaking apart, it was often not possible. Strong rotational forces could pin a person against the fuselage walls, fire could block the passage, and structural damage could seal the route entirely. More than 2,800 airmen died during training alone. These were not combat losses but accidents during formation flying. Wing collisions, stalls, and turbulence and other errors occurred while crews were still learning the skills needed for missions they might never reach. Those who survived training, completed missions, and returned home were statistical exceptions. Success required not only skill and courage but also significant luck, including weather conditions, formation position, and the exact placement of flak bursts. One example of survival came from a 20-year-old from California who entered the tail of a B-7 called Full House and completed 35 missions. His name was Larry Stevens. He was a sophomore at Alhambra High School in Southern California when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Too young to enlist, he volunteered as an air raid warden, walking through his neighborhood at night instructing residents to turn off lights. In 1943 he became eligible for service and joined the Army Air Forces. He trained at Fort Myers, Florida, where he practiced gunnery twice a day. During this period he received a letter informing him that his older brother Ernie had been killed in action in Messina, Sicily. Stevens completed his training and in December 1943 joined a 10-man B-17 crew as tail gunner. He adapted quickly to the role. While other crew members remained near at least one teammate for communication, even if only through the intercom, the tail gunner remained alone. Stevens accepted this position without issue. He knelt on the floor, leaned against a bicycle-style seat and observed the sky behind the aircraft. His plane, a B-17G named Full House, flew in the most exposed position in the formation known informally as Tails S Charlie, meaning the last aircraft in line and the first to be targeted in an attack from behind. Full House often took the initial impact of enemy engagement. On March 31, 1944, Stevens and his crew boarded the Queen Elizabeth and sailed to England in a zigzag route to avoid submarines. By late April they began combat missions. Their first mission involved light flak and no fighter interception. This did not continue. Over the next 4 months Stevens flew missions across France, Belgium, Germany, Poland, Austria, Czechoslovakia and Romania. The crew targeted submarine pens, airfields and V-1 and V-2 rocket facilities. They also dropped supplies to French resistance fighters. On June 6, 1944 they flew over Normandy during the invasion while the beaches were under fire. On a return mission from Tresau, Poland, Stevens removed his oxygen mask at 10,000 feet and attempted to relax. Suddenly the pilot shouted for the co-pilot to take control. Full House left formation and began to dive. Stevens looked forward through the fuselage and saw smoke filling the aircraft, indicating a fire somewhere inside. The waist gunner Gordon Langford took a fire extinguisher and moved forward through the bomb bay to reach the fire. He was not wearing a parachute. He crossed a 9-inch catwalk above open bomb bay doors carrying only the extinguisher. He successfully put out the fire. On August 25, 1944, Larry Stevens completed his 35th and final mission at the age of 20. In 4 months he had flown from bases in England, Russia and Italy and crossed occupied Europe many times while stationed in the tail of Full House. When he returned to New York, a customs inspector noticed his combat ribbons and told him to go home and enjoy life. Stevens instead volunteered to serve as a tail gunner on AB-25 Mitchell in the Pacific for the planned invasion of Japan. The war ended while he was still in training. He returned to Alhambra, joined the fire department and served for 31 years. He later wrote a book titled It Only Takes One. He survived the war, but not every tail gunner survived in the same way. Some survived by achieving what seemed statistically impossible. The man who fell inside the tail over Bremen was one of them. What he did during that descent was not only survival but also continued combat. Eugene Moran was born on July 17, 1924 in Wisconsin. He grew up on his family farm near Soldiers Grove, working the fields and caring for livestock. After Pearl Harbor he waited until October 1942 when he turned 18 and enlisted in the Army Air Forces. After training he joined the 96th Bombardment Group 339th Bombardment Squadron of the 8th Air Force stationed at RAF Snetterton Heath in England. He served as tail gunner on a B-17F named Rikki Tikavie, named after the mongoose from Rudyard Kipling Jungle Book. The crew completed 3 missions without incident. The 4th mission targeted Bremen. On November 29, 1943, more than 300 B-17s took off toward the city. Rikki Tikavie was part of the formation. The aircraft reached the target area and Bombardier Donald Curtis released the payload over Bremen. Then on the return leg Rikki Tikavie started to drop behind. Something was wrong with the aircraft. It drifted out of formation and moved into open sky alone and without protection. German forces detected it right away. A staffel of Bf-110s arrived first, carrying 21 cm mortar rockets designed to break bomber formations from long range. After that, single-engine fighters joined in. Bf-109s and Fw-190 surrounded the isolated bomber from all sides. Moran returned fire from the tail. The waist gunners fired from the sides. It was not enough. One after another crew members stopped answering on the intercom. 8 men were killed. Only Moran in the tail and navigator Jesse Orison in the nose were still alive. Orison left the aircraft through the forward hatch. Moran could not. The exit path from the tail was blocked. His escape hatch was jammed by bent metal. His parachute was torn apart by gunfire. Then a flak burst hit the fuselage and broke the aircraft in two. The forward section including cockpit wings and engines separated and crashed. The tail section, about 12 feet of aluminum with no useful flight control, detached and began to fall. Moran was still inside it, surrounded by ammunition and trapped between his guns and the walls of the compartment. What happened next was confirmed by ground witnesses and later verified after the war. As the tail section spun through the air, German Bf-109s continued attacking it. The pilots either did not realize it was wreckage or thought it was still an Allied aircraft under control. It appeared to be gliding. Moran, trapped inside a destroyed bomber falling from 28,000 feet, fired back. He aimed his twin Browning machine guns at the fighters making passes and pulled the triggers. German anti-aircraft units on the ground also opened fire, adding more flak to the sky around him. He was engaging enemy fighters while falling 4 miles without a parachute. The tail section struck a tree line near the town of Syke, a few miles south of Bremen. The impact threw Moran into his guns. He survived. His skull was fractured. Both forearms were broken. Several ribs were shattered and he was bleeding heavily. 2 Serbian prisoners of war who were doctors witnessed the crash and rushed to the wreckage. They pulled Moran out and treated his injuries. Later, in a prisoner of war camp, a Serbian surgeon placed a metal plate over his skull. He remained in captivity for 17 months, moving between camps in Germany, Poland and Russia. Between February and April 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed, he was forced on a 600-mile march with other prisoners. On April 26, 1945, American forces reached Bitterfeld, Germany and liberated the camp. Moran weighed 128 pounds. He was not the only tail gunner to fall from the sky and survive. 3 months before his crash over Bremen and 3 months after it, another airman survived a fall inside a severed tail section. Unlike Moran, he did not have a damaged parachute. He had none at all. On January 11, 1944, 21 B-17s from the 15th Air Force took off from Italy, heading toward Piraeus Harbor in Greece. Sergeant James Allenley was in the tail of a bomber called Skippy, leading the 2nd Squadron of the 301st Bomb Group. He had joined the Army in 1935 and transferred to the Air Forces in 1943. He preferred the tail gunner role. The formation climbed into heavy cloud cover. Visibility dropped sharply and pilots could barely see past their wings. The trailing squadrons followed procedure and briefly shifted course for spacing. It was not enough. 2 B-17s from the 97th Bomb Group flew directly into the 301st formation. The collision triggered a chain reaction. Aircraft debris and crew members fell through the clouds. 8 B-17s were destroyed within minutes. 64 airmen were killed and 17 survived. This was not caused by enemy action but by weather and the difficulty of maintaining formation flight without visibility. Allenley described feeling a sudden heavy impact. The 12-foot tail section of Skippy was torn away from the rest of the aircraft at 19,000 feet. The cockpit wings and engines moved in one direction while the tail moved in another. He was trapped between 2 machine guns and several hundred rounds of ammunition. There was no space to move. His parachute was nearby but he could not put it on. The closest escape hatch was damaged and jammed shut. The tail section began to spin. Allenley saw flashes of blue, green and brown as the wreckage rotated. He had no clear idea if the rest of the aircraft was still connected. The rotation and slow descent made him believe the full plane might still be intact and spiraling downward. He later estimated the fall lasted 10 to 15 minutes. At 19,000 feet with reduced speed due to spinning debris, this estimate was reasonable. He prayed and thought about his family. He had grown up on a farm in Kentucky as one of 9 children. He believed he had only minutes left to live. The tail section struck a group of trees on a mountainside. The branches reduced the force of the impact. The wreckage came to rest. Allen survived. His chest was sore, but he could move his arms and legs. He freed himself from the ammunition around him, found the bulkhead door and crawled out through the jammed escape hatch. He stood on the mountainside and looked around. Only the tail section remained lodged in the trees. He moved carefully down the slope from tree to tree until he reached a path. Rain began to fall. After several hours he heard voices and called out. Greek civilians found him and brought him to an Orthodox monastery where priests were sheltering Allied personnel. Out of the 17 survivors of the mid-air disaster, Allen was the only one who lived without using a parachute. After recovering, he returned to service and went back to the tail gunner position. He flew more missions. After the war he continued his military career through Korea and Vietnam and retired as a lieutenant colonel. He later visited the families of crew members who died aboard Skippy. He married Lorraine Linbury Suddle, the widow of the co-pilot Second Lieutenant Henry Suddle. He wrote an autobiography titled I Fell 4 Miles and Lived. He died in 1999 at age 82 and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Eugene Moran returned to Wisconsin after the war. He married, had 9 children and went back to farming. In 2008, Soldiers Grove named a street after him. He died on March 23, 2014 at age 90. His story was later recorded in a book titled Tailspin. Larry Stevens returned to Alhambra and rarely spoke about the war. To his neighbors he was known as a fire captain. Only decades later, when his granddaughter helped him write his memoir, did people fully learn what he had done at age 20. The book was titled It Only Takes One. 3 tail gunners, 3 separate experiences within the same war. One survived by completing 35 missions and returning home. One fell 4 miles inside a damaged aircraft and continued fighting during the descent. One rode a broken tail section through the sky without a parachute and survived to serve in 2 more wars. None of them chose the tail because it was safe. They were assigned to it or accepted it and performed their duty. Around 20,000 rear gunners never returned. If this video helped you understand their experience, then like and subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss future stories. These accounts deserve to be remembered and engagement helps them reach more people. Now consider this question. Of all positions on a heavy bomber, including tail, ball, turret, waist and nose, which one would you have chosen? Or would you have chosen none of them? Share your answer in the comments. If you know the name of a gunner from that era, someone from your family or community, add it below. Their names are still important and should be remembered.